Berlin, April 25th, 1945. Sirens scribed the morning into jagged lines. Windows rattled like loose teeth. Dust hung over Moabit in a pale veil, and the air tasted of brick and rain that never quite arrived. Karl Meissner, 17, stood in the school courtyard where weeds had outgrown the flagpole. He still carried his sketchbook under his coat, the way people carry small, useless miracles. A corporal with a clipboard read names in a voice that pretended the world hadn't already ended. "All boys over 16 to the bridge," he said. "Hold until relieved. The Fuhrer counts on you." The bridge was a thin rib of stone over a gray canal that no longer reflected anything. They were 8 in all, school coats under mismatched helmets, rifles from another war, 2 Panzerfausts that felt heavier than truth. Someone had stacked sandbags that smelled of river and rot. A map was unrolled on a crate. The red arrows weren't lines, they were closing hands. A sergeant with winter in his eyes looked them over and failed to find men. He pointed to the far parapet, to a doorway missing its door, to a tangle of barbed wire that snagged the morning like a bad thought. "Hold as long as you can," he said. Then, softer, as if speaking to himself, "as long as you can." He left. He did not come back. Karl set his sketchbook on the stone and drew the bridge the way it had been in last summer's light. Clean arches, bicycles, a woman balancing bread on her hip, the water bright as a window. When he looked up, the picture and the world refused each other. Peter arrived late, cheeks raw from the wind, grinning because that's what boys do when the ground moves. "You brought the book," he said. "Draw us brave." Karl said nothing. He drew their shadows instead, long, thin, and already leaving. Across the canal, a tram sat derailed, its bell a dumb mouth. Somewhere, a radio insisted victory was near. The sound skimmed the water and died on the stones. They practiced with empty rifles. They rehearsed courage in whispers. Karl counted steps between cover like a prayer with numbers instead of saints. By noon, the east had started to growl, not thunder, something with tracks. The boys went quiet in that way a room does when a teacher enters, only there were no teachers left. A breathless runner handed them a sheet torn from a ledger. "Hold Moabit Bridge, expect armor, expect relief." Expectation had become a rumor. They built a barricade of doors and school desks. Chalk dust rose in the light like undone sums. On one desktop, someone had carved, "We will meet after," and the word "after" looked like a country that had been invaded. Peter nudged him. "After where?" Karl closed the sketchbook and slipped it inside his coat. "After anywhere," he said, and felt the lie settle like ash. Evening slid in early. Smoke drew bars across the sky. Civilians moved in quiet lines along the embankment, bundles, bicycles, a cat in a coat sleeve. No one looked up. A woman pressed a heel of bread into Karl's palm and did not ask his name. He broke it into 3 pieces. It tasted like dust, pretending to be yesterday. When the searchlights probed the cloud, the city showed its bones. Walls without rooms, stairs that went nowhere, a tree blackened into the shape of a cry. Peter hummed a tune that could not remember its ending. The youngest of the Macs practiced lifting the Panzerfaust to his shoulder until his arm shook. He asked if tanks bled. No one answered. Karl wrote on a scrap torn from a ration card and hid it under a sandbag. "We are guarding a memory." The wind found the edge and tried to read. Night thinned into the kind of gray that makes faces look older. Somewhere, church bells tried once and stopped, embarrassed. From far off, the low, patient sound returned, the approach of metal that doesn't hurry. Peter touched Carl's sleeve. "Ready," Carl breathed, and the breath looked like smoke. "As ready as a drawing," he said. The bridge waited with them, stone holding its own breath. The canal forgot how to move. The city leaned closer to listen. What followed would not be loud at first. It would begin with a shiver in the stones, a tremor under boots, the sensation of history arriving without knocking, and 8 boys, left alone to keep a promise made by men who had already left the room. If relief was coming, it would have to find them before the morning did. Berlin, April 26, 1945. Morning crawled in, gray and hesitant, as if afraid of what it might see. The smoke over Moabit thickened until it became weather. Ash drifted through the air like snow that had forgotten what season it belonged to. Carl rubbed his hands together for warmth, though the chill came more from inside. Around him, the boys were trying to act like soldiers. They checked rifles that jammed before they fired, adjusted helmets that slipped over their ears, and muttered orders no one had given them. Peter climbed onto the parapet and looked east. "They're close," he said. The others didn't ask how he knew. Everyone could feel it. The deep, slow pulse beneath the cobblestones, the earth remembering the weight of approaching armor. Carl took out his sketchbook. The graphite broke at the first line. He sharpened it with his knife, watching the shavings curl and fall into the dust. He wanted to draw the bridge again, to give it edges, to make it something human. Instead, he drew a hand holding nothing. Max, the youngest, only 15, crouched beside him. "Why do you draw?" he asked. Carl shrugged. "So I don't forget what things used to look like." Max looked around at the ruins. "You think they'll look like this forever?" Carl didn't answer. By noon, the noise grew. The sky itself seemed to vibrate. The boys crouched behind their barricade of doors and desks, breathing in time with the rumble. A truck rattled over the far end of the bridge. A man in an officer's coat jumped down, middle-aged, face pale, hands trembling. He looked around at the teenagers, the rifles, the sandbags. His expression flickered between pity and disbelief. "Where's your commander?" No one answered. He muttered something under his breath, lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, and stared eastward. "You boys hold here," he said finally. "The Fuhrer counts on your courage." Then he dropped the cigarette, ground it into the stones, and climbed back into the truck. It disappeared into the fog. They never saw him again. The hours after that stretched into silence. Nothing moved but the smoke. The boys passed a canteen between them. Someone had found a half bar of chocolate. They broke it into tiny squares, each piece dissolving too quickly to taste. Carl opened his sketchbook again. He began writing instead of drawing. The city feels like an old man breathing. Every building exhales dust. The bridges are bones. We are the skin that hasn't learned it's gone. Peter leaned over his shoulder and read, "You always write like the world's already finished." Carl smiled weakly. "Maybe it is." Toward evening, the air changed, heavier, charged. Pigeons exploded from the rafters of a burned warehouse across the canal. A low growl followed. Max whispered, "Tanks." They scrambled to positions. Peter handed out the last of the ammunition, 6 rounds between them. The Panzerfausts waited in the corner. like questions no one wanted to ask. Carl glanced toward the west. The sun was a dull coin behind the smoke. He thought of his mother, probably still in their basement near Alexanderplatz, praying to a God who had stopped answering weeks ago. "Think they'll send help?" Max asked. Carl said, "They already did." Max frowned. "Who?" Carl looked around at their faces, tired, young, absurdly alive. "Us. When the first shell landed, it didn't hit them. It struck a block away, sending up a fountain of glass and dust that rained across the canal. The sound arrived after the sight, heavy and final. "Positions!" Peter shouted, though there was nowhere to go. They crouched behind the barricade, hearts hammering, breaths loud in the smoke. The second shell fell closer, shaking the bridge. A brick slid from the parapet, splashing into the canal below. The ripples spread out, slow and useless. Carl lifted his rifle, sighted on the eastern road. Through the haze, he saw shapes, big, deliberate, patient. T-34s. He had seen them in photographs once. They were not supposed to be real. He felt something break inside him, not fear exactly, but the understanding that fear was the only thing left that still worked. He reached for his sketchbook and tore out a page. With the stub of his pencil, he wrote quickly, "If anyone finds this, tell whoever wins that we were here, not fighting, just here." He folded the page, slipped it into the pocket over his heart, and looked at Peter. "Draw later," Peter said. "Shoot now." Carl nodded. "If there's still later." The next shell hit the far end of the bridge. The sound was not an explosion. It was a full sentence ending in a period. Wood splintered. Smoke swallowed the street. Max fired his rifle. The kick nearly knocked him over. Peter shouted something lost in the noise. Carl fired too, not at anything, just into the dust, to remind himself he existed. For a few moments, they became everything the posters had promised, brave silhouettes against smoke. And then the smoke cleared, and they were only boys again. Night fell like a curtain too heavy to lift. The shooting stopped. The rumble faded westward. They were still on the bridge, but the bridge no longer felt like ground. Carl sat down, breathing through the metallic taste of fear. He looked at the others, faces smeared with soot, eyes wide and hollow. Peter broke the silence. "We held it?" Carl looked at the broken stones, the gaps in the railing, the water below littered with burning paper. "Held what?" he asked. No one answered. He took out his notebook again, the pencil shaking. "We were told to defend Berlin. But Berlin has already left us behind." He closed the book. The page smelled of smoke. Above them, the night sky glowed red, not from sunset, but from a city on fire. In the distance, bells rang once, then stopped, swallowed by the wind. The boys leaned against their rifles, staring into nothing, waiting for a dawn that might never arrive. And Berlin waited with them, silent, surrounded, still pretending it had something left to defend. Berlin, April 27th, 1945. They didn't sleep. None of them did. The night crouched low over the bridge, heavy and close, and every sound felt like a question that might end with death. Carl sat with his back against a wall that no longer reached the ceiling. The moonlight slipped through the smoke in fractured pieces. His hands were raw from the cold, his heart raw from everything else. Peter had found a radio earlier that day, small, cracked, but still alive. He fiddled with the dial until a voice emerged from the static. smooth and unreal. It spoke of victory, of resistance, of destiny. They all listened in silence, the way one listens to a ghost reciting a story it no longer believes. When the voice ended, Peter turned the radio off. No one said a word. At dawn, the shells began again. Short bursts. Farther away this time. It was almost merciful. The kind of sound that doesn't kill you, just reminds you you're still in the way. Carl stood, stretched his legs, and looked east. The horizon was nothing but smoke and movement. He couldn't tell where the city ended and the army began. Max was sitting cross-legged by the sandbags, polishing his rifle with a torn sleeve. He hummed quietly to himself, something that might have been a lullaby once. When Carl looked closer, he saw that the rifle wasn't even loaded. "You're wasting your time," Carl said. Max looked up, smiled weakly. Maybe the rifle wants to feel useful. They talked less as the day went on. Words felt fragile, easily broken in the air. They just waited. For orders, for reinforcements, for the sound of tanks that never came. Carl took out his sketchbook again, but the pencil barely moved. The page stayed white, too clean for what was happening around it. He closed it, stared at the cover. He remembered his father's voice, deep, confident, the sound of certainty. "If ever the country calls, you answer, Carl. It's what men do." But now all the men were gone, and only the boys had answered. By afternoon, the sun was pale and distant, filtered through the veil of dust. The air smelled of smoke, diesel, and something like rain that never fell. Every now and then a door slammed somewhere in the city, and the echo traveled through the ruins like a lost soul. Peter climbed up to the top of the barricade and scanned the streets with binoculars. "Nothing," he said. Carl nodded. "Then we wait for nothing." "Maybe nothing's better than what's coming," Peter replied. A civilian wandered down the street, an old man with a cane, his coat torn, a white cloth tied to the end of a stick. He called out to them. "Go home, boys, it's over," Peter shouted back. "Orders say we stay." The old man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Orders? Whose orders? The dead don't give orders anymore." Then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the smoke. No one chased him. They didn't need to, he was right, but they stayed anyway. That night it rained ash, fine, white, endless. It clung to their hair, their clothes, their weapons. For a moment it almost looked peaceful, like snow on Christmas. Max held out his hand, watching it gather on his palm. He smiled faintly. "It's beautiful," he said. Carl stared at it. "It's what's left of beautiful." Peter lit a cigarette, the ember trembling at the tip. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke drift upward into the same air that had already burned 1,000 times. "Do you think they'll remember us?" he asked. Carl looked out at the city, where the glow of fires painted the sky orange. "No," he said, "and maybe that's mercy." The night deepened. Somewhere far off, a tank fired again. The sound rolled across the city like thunder crawling over bones. Carl opened his notebook, wrote by the light of Peter's cigarette. "We keep waiting for orders, but maybe the order is the waiting. Berlin feels like a dying animal still trying to breathe." He stopped, stared at the words, then closed the book. There was nothing left to write that didn't already hurt. When the last shell of the night landed, it wasn't close, but close enough to make the bridge shiver. Max covered his ears, eyes wide. Peter put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry. If they wanted us gone, we'd already be gone." Carl looked at him. "You really believe that?" Peter smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they've stopped believing in anything. "No," he said, "but it helps me breathe." When dawn came again, gray and uncertain, Carl stood at the edge of the bridge and watched the river below. The water was slow, thick with debris, burnt wood, a helmet, a single shoe. He whispered to himself, "Berlin keeps flowing, even when no one else does." Behind him, the boys still slept, if you could call it sleep. The radio was silent now. Even the static had stopped trying, and for a long time, the only sound left was the city itself, sighing, breaking, waiting to be forgiven. Berlin, April 28th, 1945. The city finally stopped pretending. The ground shook before the sun rose, the sky flashed white, and the bridge, their bridge, came alive with dust and noise. The waiting was over. Carl woke to the sound of Peter shouting orders that weren't orders, just fear rearranged into words. Max was crying and didn't know it. The air itself burned. Every breath tasted like brick and gunpowder. A shell struck the far end of the street, throwing a cart into the air. Its wheels spun once before crashing down. Flames bloomed where people used to live. Carl grabbed his rifle and ran to the parapet. Across the canal, tanks rolled through the smoke, their silhouettes slow and inevitable. He counted 3 at first, then 5. Then he stopped counting. Peter shouted, "Aim for the tracks! Wait until they're close!" But his voice was lost in the storm. The world had become one long, continuous explosion. Carl lifted the rifle, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He fired anyway. The kick slammed into his shoulder. The shot went wide. Max fired too. The crack of his rifle drowned in the roar of engines. A bullet struck the stone near Carl's head. He ducked, heart hammering, and pressed his face into the dirt. He thought, absurdly, about how the ground smelled like rain. He heard Peter shouting again. He looked up and saw him standing on the sandbags, the Panzerfaust on his shoulder, hair whipping in the wind. He looked too young, too alive to be there. Peter fired. The blast threw him backward. The tank burst into fire. For one impossible second, the boys cheered, a sound too small against the roar of war. Then another shell landed. The bridge groaned, cracked, screamed. Carl felt himself lifted from the ground, thrown against the wall. The world went white, then black, then red behind his eyes. When he opened them again, there was silence, a thick, heavy silence full of ringing and smoke. He tasted blood, felt heat on his cheek. The barricade was gone. So was half the bridge. He crawled forward, dragging himself over the rubble. The canal glowed orange with fire. Bodies lay twisted among the sandbags. Familiar shapes made strange by stillness. He found Peter near the parapet. The Panzerfaust was beside him, split in two. His eyes were open, staring at the sky, but they didn't see it. Carl pressed his hand to Peter's shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, "we did it. We stopped them." He waited for an answer that never came. The tanks kept moving, rolling past, not even slowing down. Berlin was already theirs. They didn't need to take it again. Max was still alive. He was sitting against a wall, holding his arms, staring at the ground. When Carl reached him, he looked up with empty eyes. "They said reinforcements were coming," he whispered. Carl nodded. "Maybe they got lost." The boy laughed once, a short, broken sound, then coughed until it became silence. Carl sat beside him, watching the smoke drift over the river. It was beautiful in a way that made him sick, the way destruction always looks complete. He pulled out his sketchbook, its cover scorched, pages torn. He opened to a blank sheet and stared at it for a long time. There was nothing left to draw, nothing left to save. He tore a corner from the page and wrote, "We were told to hold the bridge. We held until there was nothing left to hold." He folded the scrap and placed it in Peter's pocket. Hours passed. The sun burned through the haze, turning the smoke gold. Soviet soldiers appeared on the far bank, silhouettes moving through fire. Carl froze. He expected them to shoot, but they didn't. One of them, a young man barely older than Carl, saw him and stopped. Their eyes met across the distance, two boys wearing different uniforms, equally tired. The soldier lowered his rifle. He shouted something in Russian that Carl couldn't understand, then motioned toward the city. "Away, go, live." Carl nodded slowly, stood, and raised his empty hands. The soldier watched him walk until the smoke hid them from each other. Carl wandered through streets that no longer had names. Windows were shattered, trees split in half, trams frozen mid-turn. He stepped over rubble, past the bodies of people who had believed what he once believed. He stopped once, looked back toward the bridge. It was gone now, broken in the middle. Half of it collapsed into the canal. The water swallowed everything, the sandbags, the rifles, the dreams. He whispered, "It's over." The word didn't echo. It just hung in the air for a moment, then disappeared like smoke. He found shelter that night in the ruins of a bookstore. He lit a candle with trembling hands and opened the sketchbook again. In the margin of the last page, he wrote, "We weren't defending a city. We were just trying not to disappear." He set the book aside, leaned his head against the wall, and closed his eyes. Outside, the guns were quiet for the first time in years. The silence was louder than the war had ever been. Berlin, May 2nd, 1945. The city had stopped making noise. No sirens, no gunfire, no engines. Only the occasional groan of a wall giving up its balance. The low hum of smoke still rising from where everything used to matter. Carl walked through it, barefoot now, his boots lost somewhere on the bridge. Each step left a print in the gray dust that covered the streets like snow. He followed no path, only the instinct to keep moving, because stopping felt too much like dying. He passed what used to be a bakery. The sign was still hanging, letters half melted, the smell of burnt sugar ghosting the air. He remembered the taste of bread from years ago, the warmth of his mother's hands pressing dough. It felt like someone else's memory now, borrowed from a quieter world. A blackened piano sat in the middle of the street, keys warped and yellow. He pressed one out of habit. It made no sound. He crossed a square where the statue of a soldier lay face down, one arm missing. Around it, civilians moved like shadows, thin, slow, eyes empty. A woman carried a baby wrapped in curtains. An old man pushed a bicycle with no tires. No one looked at Carl. Everyone was too busy surviving the silence. He stopped near the entrance to a subway station. A chalk message on the wall read, "Frieden, peace." The handwriting was small and uncertain, as if the person who wrote it didn't quite believe the word. He descended into the station. The air was damp, thick with smoke and sweat. Families huddled along the platform, faces pale in the candlelight. Someone was boiling water in a tin pot. Someone else prayed quietly into their sleeve. A woman looked up as Carl passed. Her eyes widened. "You're just a boy," she said. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to tell her he wasn't sure what he was anymore. But he just nodded and kept walking. At the far end of the tunnel, he found a small room where the air was still. He sat down, pulled out his sketchbook, now nearly burned through, edges curled. He opened to the first clean page and began to write. The war ended yesterday. No one cheered. No one knew how. He paused, listening to the murmurs behind him, children whispering, someone coughing, the sound of feet shifting in restless sleep. They said victory would sound like music. It sounds like breathing. He turned the pencil over in his hand. The tip had broken days ago. He scratched the words into the paper anyway, pressing so hard that the page tore. We waited for help that was never coming. Maybe the waiting was the lesson. He leaned back, eyes half closed. In the distance, he could still hear the muffled rhythm of artillery. Far away now, like a heartbeat, the world was trying to forget. He thought of Peter, of Max, of the bridge. He thought of the tank commander who had spared him and wondered if that man had gone home too, if he even knew what mercy was worth anymore. Above him, faint sunlight filtered through the cracks in the stairwell. The city was trying to remember daylight. Later, he climbed back up to the street. The smoke had thinned. Crows circled above the rooftops, black specks moving slow and aimless. He walked until he reached the canal. The bridge was still there, half collapsed, its reflection trembling in the murky water. He stood at the edge, staring at it. The surface moved with the wind, carrying small pieces of ash downstream, fragments of uniforms, bits of paper, someone's photograph. Carl reached into his coat and took out the sketchbook one last time. He tore out the final page, the one he had written on the night before, and held it between his fingers. We were told to defend Berlin, but Berlin died before we ever picked up a gun. He folded it carefully, then let it fall into the water. The paper floated for a moment, turning slowly, then sank. The ripples spread outward, quiet and infinite. He watched until it was gone. Behind him, the first real sound of peace began. Footsteps, voices, a cart being pushed across the rubble. Someone somewhere was laughing softly, as if testing whether the world would allow it. Carl turned away from the bridge and started walking. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew that he wanted to keep walking until the air no longer smelled like fire. Years later, they would rebuild that bridge. They would give it a new name, plant trees along the banks, pave the streets again. Children would ride bicycles across it, chasing each other's shadows in the afternoon sun. No one would think about the boys who once waited there with rifles too heavy for their hands. And somewhere beneath their wheels, in the dark water below, a page of Carl's sketchbook would still be resting, ink fading, words dissolving, truth slowly becoming part of the river. What Berlin rebuilt in stone, it never repaired in memory. And somewhere, between silence and survival, a 17-year-old boy remained, guarding a bridge that no longer existed. Berlin, 1985. The city no longer smoked. The air was clean, almost too clean, like someone had scrubbed history from it. Glass towers rose where ruins had once stood. Trams hummed along tracks that no longer trembled. Berlin had been rebuilt, bright, modern, alive. but some corners of it still whispered. Karl Meissner, now gray-haired and thin, walked slowly down Invalidenstrasse. He carried a small cane, not because he needed it, but because it gave his hand something to do when the memories came too close. The crowds parted around him, businessmen, students, tourists. No one looked twice. He was just another old man swallowed by the rhythm of a city that had forgotten its own silence. He stopped at the edge of the canal. The bridge stood ahead, new, elegant, the concrete smooth, the rails polished. There was no plaque, no sign, no memory, only the water below, slow and green, carrying sunlight instead of ash. Karl rested both hands on the railing. The metal was cold, but alive. Children laughed somewhere behind him, 2 boys racing their bicycles across the span. Their laughter echoed faintly against the water, the same sound the world had lost 40 years before. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was back there. April 1945, the bridge trembling beneath his boots, Peter shouting, Max praying, the sky breaking open, the sound of tanks, the smell of dust and fire, the faces of boys who thought duty meant destiny. He felt the weight of the rifle again, the heat of the flame, the cold that came after. He opened his eyes. The bridge was whole again, but the ghosts hadn't left. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, an old pencil stub, the last remnant of his sketchbook. He had kept it through everything, the camps, the rebuilding, the years when no one wanted to talk about that war. It was worn smooth, barely more than a splinter, but it was his last proof that he had once been 16 and still believed that drawing could make sense of the world. He turned it between his fingers, smiled faintly, and let it fall into the water. It sank without a ripple. A young woman passing by stopped, curious. She had a camera around her neck and a notebook in her hand. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked in careful German. Karl nodded. "Just visiting an old friend," he said. She looked around, confused. "Who?" He pointed to the water. She followed his gaze but saw only the reflection of the bridge. He smiled again, gently. Someone who never left. They stood together in silence for a moment. The afternoon light spilled over the canal, soft and forgiving. In the distance, church bells rang, the same bells that had fallen silent on the day Berlin surrendered. He listened until they faded, then whispered quietly to himself, "We thought we were defending Berlin, but Berlin was never a city of stone. It was the people who dreamed inside it, and we lost them long before the bombs fell." He looked up at the skyline, new towers, clean windows, the hum of life rebuilt. The city looked nothing like the one he'd fought for, and yet, in its noise, he finally heard something that sounded like peace. He turned to leave. Behind him, the river carried the last shimmer of evening light. It caught for a second on the surface, a flash of gold, before vanishing into the shadows beneath the bridge. Karl stopped once more, looked back, and spoke softly, as if to the water itself. "We were boys pretending to be soldiers, and in the end, it was the pretending that saved us." Then he smiled, small, tired but true, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. The camera would stay on the bridge a little longer, the water rippling gently, the sunlight trembling like breath. And if you listened closely enough, you could almost hear it, the echo of laughter, the scrape of chalk on a school desk, the voice of a boy saying, "We held the line," not for victory, not for orders, but because they didn't yet know how to stop believing in tomorrow. Berlin lives, the bridge stands, and somewhere beneath it, the last drawing of a boy who survived the end of the world is still dissolving into the river, one line at a time.